Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, there are just a few housekeeping points. When joining the internet link, you will have been given the option of joining through your computer's audio or dialing in via the telephone. If you have difficulty connecting to the audio, please message the Centre for Science and Security Studies, the host, using the chat box. On a PC or laptop, the chat box is to the right-hand side. If you're using a phone or tablet, you'll have to toggle this view to see it. To manage the session, this is all one-way audio. All participants are currently muted, so if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box. If you're using a PC or laptop, the Q&A button is in the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you're using a phone or tablet, you may have to toggle this too, so please have a quick look now. Please also use the opportunity to ensure that the slides are visible and minimize any features such as participant videos that you may find distracting. I should also note this presentation will use polls. All polls are anonymous, so please do not worry about your answers when you're voting. Today's session is on radiological security and is planned to last for 45 minutes with a questions and answer session at the end. The session is being recorded and will be available for viewing after the session. At the end of the session, there will also be a short questionnaire for your feedback. This is very useful for us to see if you enjoyed the format or have any recommendations. Now, without any further delay, I'm pleased to announce that we're joined by Dr. Chris Englefield. Dr. Englefield is a former regulator and a consultant on regulatory affairs. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Carl. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. I'll be talking about the regulation of radioactive sources, but with particular emphasis on cultural issues. I seem to have, right. So against a background of study in nuclear security culture, I would like to just remind you about some of the reasons for regulating radioactive sources in every respect, and ask you to think about if radioactive source security might be different in any way. We'll briefly review international approaches to radioactive source security. Many of you will already be familiar with that, but not everybody. And also look at the effect of regulatory culture on security culture. And just to give you some form of illustration of what has happened in the UK, I'll be looking at examples of what we've done in this country from the point of view of good experiences, and finishing with a brief case study of a less good experience in the UK, which I thought might be of interest. So, can I start off with one of the polls? Can I ask you, please, what sector are you from? Which of these options is closest to the sort of work that you do? Are we ready with your response? Here we go. So, wow, we have a very high proportion of regulators, a lot of people in education, fewer in industry and medical, and some others. That's really interesting. Thank you for that. Let's move on. So let's go right back to the beginning and ask ourselves why radioactive sources are regulated at all. Now, clearly, I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience, but radioactive sources have many beneficial uses. You'll be very aware of that. And clearly also they can be harmful. So our societies expect that they're used safely, and primarily that's the responsibility of the user or the operator. And the role of regulators is really to make sure that operators are keeping us safe. So regulators keep us safe by verifying accepted standards of safe use of these potentially hazardous materials are being implemented. And you'll be very aware that often the standards by which regulators assess practice in the field are driven by documents provided by the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, the IAEA. So there are things that need to be looked at, and because of the international nature of the industry of radioactive sources and the international nature of many of the practices, oil exploration, medicine, and so on, there's a need for common standards. And probably the biggest influence in this respect has been the IAEA, which has published a huge collection of guidance, which has catalyzed a very high level of international collaboration, and there's a reasonably high level of uniformity around the world. Now, until about, in terms of what's been published anyway, until about 2004, and starting with the driver in 2001, the emphasis was very much about safety. And from 2001, clearly security was added to the agenda. And the reason for that was the concern about dirty bombs, which were one of the so-called four faces of nuclear terrorism. So the addition of security, there was perhaps some perception that these are different, but actually I think it's really important to understand that safety and security, well, I describe them as being as two sides of the same coin. They must go hand in hand. So I mentioned the vast range of IAEA documents that have been produced. Traditionally, the ones on the left are about safety. And then in 2004, the Code of Conduct on the Safety and Security of Radioactive Sources was introduced, and some additional supporting guidance on import and export. So from this point onwards, security was increasingly important in the agenda around the world. I'm sure most of you are aware, but in case you are not, there's a huge collection of IAEA documents available for free to download from their website. So is radioactive source security any different from any other type of regulation of radioactive sources? Well, clearly my proposition is that it is a bit different. In any state, the regulatory body sets the tone of the regulatory culture. And this is really the main theme of what I want to talk about today. It's about the interaction between the regulatory body and the people that they're regulating. And I think it's really important that this is at least thought about carefully. The nature, the tone of the regulatory culture is clearly a local decision. And I'm not trying to tell people how to set their own regulatory culture. What I'm trying to do today is simply to give an indication of how we approached it in the UK and what we see as the benefits for us. But what I would hope also is that there are benefits that you will at least see in terms of thinking about the various issues. Now, clearly, there's a whole raft of information about culture that's available, and many of you will be well aware of it. But from the point of view of the regulatory body, the regulatory culture is about the style, if you like, the tone, the approach that the regulatory body takes to its work. And there, in my experience, there are very many ways that this can be influenced. Any regulatory body will depend on funding from government to a greater or lesser extent. And you can't get away from the fact that directors of a regulatory body will be mindful, will be concerned about ensuring that they get adequate funding in the future. So they will be thinking about their relationship with their masters, the government. The exact relationship between government and regulator is another question which we haven't got time to go into today. But let's assume for the moment that there is a separation between the regulatory body and the government. Clearly, the regulator is dependent on government for funding. Let's also be realistic. This is a safe environment for talking. Directors of regulatory bodies, like directors of any organisation, will have their own aspirations, their own drives, their own interests, and their own personalities, which will be reflected in the tone of the work that they are directing. So that's one of the other influences. Now, depending on the profile of the regulatory body, which, to be honest, for radioactive sources is often very low with the public, there will be some degree of influence from the expectations of the public. And certainly if there's been an incident previously in a country, then it seems likely the profile of the regulator can be higher. And if the directors are concerned about the potential for problems arising, and this in a very adverse way, raising the profile of the regulatory body, then they will be concerned about the image and the maintenance of the reputation of their organisation. So all of these things together, in some way, will determine the philosophy, the tone, the manner, the style. Not quite sure what the right word is, but I think you know what I mean. It's the approach which is culturally embedded in the organisation. And somehow, starting at the top, the directors need to set precise values and instill these in the staff, because what the directors want is for the staff to deliver the tone of culture that they have chosen. So in my experience, having travelled quite widely around the world in my role as a regulator, but also as a consultant to the IAEA and others, there seems to me to be two basic forms of regulatory culture. One of them is very much outcome-based, and that's really what I'm talking about today. But the alternative, and this has happened in my country in the past, is that the culture is very much targets-driven. This is what in the UK we call bean counting. Now, I don't wish to be insulting of anyone, and certainly not the people that run the finances of the regulatory body, but very often, because of this relationship between the regulator and government, the need to convince government that the regulator is doing a good job is demonstrated by performance targets. And those performance targets will sometimes very much influence the amount of money that the regulator is given by the government. Now, this is all well and good, and I have to say the organisation that I used to work for has previously been very much driven, and still is in many ways, by a targets-driven approach. Key performance indicators are very important. So in the example of the UK regulatory body, at least that part of it which I worked for, both of these approaches may be used, perhaps at different times, as the regulatory body matures in its role. So, in the context of the prevailing regulatory culture, the approach, if you like, that the regulators take, is security of radioactive sources, RAS, is that a different issue for the regulator? Well, my experience suggests that it can be, it might be. And the reason is that in some countries, and mine is an example, the level of threat is clearly recognised, it's clearly high, and it does tend to motivate people. In other countries, the level of threat will be much lower, and they will have different motivations. But in a country like the UK, where there's been, for the best part of 20 years now, a high threat level, it's been quite clear that radioactive source security is especially important. Our security services have expressed the view in the past that the use of radioactive sources to make some form of weapon, some form of dirty bomb, is essentially inevitable. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And if that's the case, if they're right, then clearly any responsible user of radioactive sources, as well as the regulator, will want to protect them appropriately. So what we found in the UK is because the user community, the people that we regulate, are very aware of the issues for our country, there has been a change in the approach. And on both sides, there's been really an unspoken agreement that compliance with security requirements is actually more important than what in the past, anyway, in my regulatory authority, my regulatory body, I should say, was the tendency sometimes to want to have success in enforcement, to have more prosecutions each year or more notices of some kind each year. Those things still apply in most parts of the work of the regulatory body, but as you'll see later, not really for radioactive source security. So one of the approaches is that directors may choose to put emphasis on achieving security as of radioactive sources as the outcome they're looking for, rather than the performance targets being the predominant factor, even if other aspects of regulation of radioactive sources of the nuclear field generally is driven by targets, performance indicators. Now, I want to emphasize again that the decisions about what sort of tone, what sort of style the regulator takes clearly have to be local. It's not for anyone like me to dictate to anyone other than the people within my own organization what the tone of the regulatory culture should be like. So this, I would emphasize, is an example. And what we've found in the UK is that it was really useful for the decision makers, the directors of the regulatory body, to be briefed, to be made aware of the difference between simply meeting performance statistics, which is their normal, we would say, bread and butter, their normal approach to management of the regulatory body by looking at all the performance statistics. And actually, if they're well briefed, they may understand, and we found that that worked in this country, that more important is achieving a strong nuclear security culture. So the question then becomes, how can that realization be used to get the best performance in terms of compliance in security from users and operators? And that's not an easy thing to do, but let's look at it briefly now. Before we do, can I just ask, if you think about your regulatory body, and don't forget this is anonymous, so no one knows what anybody has said, but as a matter of interest, thinking about either the regulatory body that you work for or the regulatory body that oversees your own work if you're representing the user, would you describe the style of the regulatory body that you work with as strict or confrontational or collaborative, or are you just not sure? Can I ask you to choose the category that best fits your situation, please? Right, do we have a result? Okay, well, I'm very pleased to see that most people feel that there's a collaborative approach with the regulatory body. A very small proportion of people see that there's a strict confrontational sort of approach, and 30% of you are not really sure what happens. Well, that's fair enough. It may not have been something you've previously thought about very much. Maybe you don't see the regulator very often anyway. So let's carry on. I've spoken about the different styles, a confrontational style versus a more collaborative style, but there are two technical approaches to regulation which are recognized in the literature and particularly by the IAEA. There's the so-called performance-based approach. This is based on the design basis threat, and we'll revisit that very briefly in just a moment. So this is one approach. The second approach is the so-called prescriptive one. Now this is not necessarily dependent on the design basis threat, the DBT, though the IAEA recommends that the DBT is used in this way. So let's look at each of those in a bit more detail. The design basis threat, the IAEA document that provides guidance on this, is on the right of the slide. It provides a profile of the adversary. It provides information, insight into the nature of the threat. So it's talking about motivation of the adversary, the composition, the capabilities. And this sort of approach is fairly widely used, I think, on nuclear sites, nuclear power stations and things of that nature. And on that basis, expert specialist teams within a nuclear site will be employed simply to design, maintain, and continuously improve physical protection systems to protect against acts of terrorism. And they'll be designing their arrangements based on the design basis threat, which might, for example, be described in summary as 5 people with light weapons. We assume they've got access to about 2 kilograms of explosives, and they've got hand tools and modern battery-powered tools. That's, in summary, what the design basis threat provides, an indication of, amongst other things, capability. So, very widely used in the nuclear field, and the approach that's taken is that the design basis threat is the starting point, and normally at least some information from the design basis threat, not all of it necessarily, because it can be very sensitive information indeed, will be shared with the operator of a nuclear site. And the approach they take is to say that your physical protection system, your security measures, must defeat the design basis threat. A team from the adversary, equipped and motivated to the way that's described in the national threat assessment. So, as I say, often in the nuclear industry, there will be a team, maybe a large team, designing engineering solutions to meet the challenge of the design basis threat. That often will then be tested. Does it actually meet the challenge? The outcome of the test is the security system either fails to meet the challenge or meets the challenge, and if it fails, then further improvements are required. So this is a complex, highly developed, and quite expensive process. But it works very well for nuclear sites. However, its disadvantage, in my view, is that it requires the operator to have access to a great deal of expertise in security. Staff who are able to assess the existing security measures and determine whether it's enough to meet or expected to be enough anyway, to meet the adversary at the level of the design basis threat. So it's a complex and expensive process to operate and sustain. And if this approach is imposed on operators just using radioactive sources, my experience is even the lightest influence from the regulator, which involves spending money on anything for users, does not do a great deal of good for the relationship between the regulator and the operator. Now, I'm not talking about a relationship which is about friendship. I'm talking about a relationship which is about a professional approach. The point, surely, of an effective regulator is that their relationship with the user is about respect on both sides, respect between the regulatory body and the user. It's not about one or the other being subordinate. It's about respect between the two. If the user is dominant, then the regulatory body is not being respected. And I have to say, in some parts of the world, at least in the past, I've seen this, where the regulatory body behaves in a very subordinate fashion. I don't believe that is a healthy approach. But equally, and if I'm frank, I've seen this happen in the UK, if the regulatory body is too dominant, then the user will not respect them, will not go beyond the absolute minimum that they're required to do. And what we decided in the UK was that we needed the goodwill, we needed the commitment of the users to help us do our job, which was to ensure that the security of radioactive sources was maintained. So it was really important to establish a good working relationship. We decided that we wouldn't take the performance-based approach. We would take instead a more prescriptive approach. And I'll explain something about why this was and what this means. In the prescriptive approach, and there are degrees of variation on this, but essentially the regulator tells the operator almost exactly what to do. You will install a category 3 security rated door here. You will have 2 physical barriers for a category 2 source. You will do this, you will do that. Now, there can be some flexibility around this. You will choose from this catalogue of security rated doors. You can, if you can't have a second physical barrier, which is a concrete wall, then maybe a steel cage is easier for you. You can play tunes, you can take variations on this approach. But the principle is the regulator tells the operator what to do. Now, the difficulty with this, of course, certainly in the early days, and I think still today, is that it assumes that the regulator knows what they're doing. Now, there has, in my experience, been a tendency for regulatory bodies to assume they know everything about everything, that they know how to tell any business, whether it's an industrial radiographer or a hospital, how best to protect their sources in such a way that it doesn't hinder and doesn't get in the way of what they're trying to do. I like to say in almost all my presentations, to be honest, that the purpose of radioactive source security is to enable people to do their work, because in the security climate, rather than to stop them doing their work because of the security climate. So it's very important that the regulator, the person prescribing what needs to be done, understands the business. Clearly, therefore, there has to be a good relationship, a good dialogue between the user and the regulator. But the problem, certainly in the early days, was that the regulator in the UK just did not have that knowledge. Until about 2002, there was no knowledge within the regulatory body about what we would recognise today, anyway, as physical protection and security as a whole. So if you can provide that technical advice on physical security, then it takes away the requirement for the operator to have it. It enables the operator to do what they have to do without recruiting, paying for expensive in-house expertise or getting in a consultant. And if they get in a consultant, can they, how do they know they can trust them? It also means, this approach, that because the regulatory body has said this is what you will do, it's quite easy to assess compliance as regulators. There's no need for huge teams to go in and test with stopwatches and clipboards an assault by a friendly force pretending to be the adversary, and measuring the time, for example, that a door or a fence holds back, delays the adversary. So my view is that this prescriptive approach is a very efficient way of managing, from the regulatory point of view, large numbers of sites. And if you get it right, the prescriptive approach, I believe, provides a high level of consistency across sites, because the body of expertise, which might be the regulator themselves, is providing the same advice to everyone. I don't know what it's like in your country, but if you've got a nuclear industry or not, but in the nuclear industry in the UK, there's a lot of autonomy, a lot of flexibility within the various nuclear operators, and consistency may not be achieved. That may or may not matter. It's just a fact, an observation. From the point of view of the regulatory body, needing fewer people to do regulation means that some performance targets can look quite impressive using the prescriptive approach, and that's good for the regulatory bodies continuing funding, from example, from government. So the prescriptive approach is my preferred approach, and you will have gathered that my preferred approach is an outcome-based approach rather than a target-based approach for the security of radioactive sources. The point here being is what we're trying to achieve is suitable levels of protection, physical protection, suitable levels of security for the radioactive sources which are in use in a wide range of industries. However, there's always a disadvantage, isn't there, in everything? There are always pros and cons. And the prescriptive approach does put some risk, I call it regulatory risk, onto the regulatory body. And all right, if you're a user, you're thinking, well, what's this got to do with me? Well, maybe this is helpful for you because you'll understand the thinking of the regulatory body a bit better. And maybe that might influence the way you relate to your regulators. One of the risks that's created is that if it's the regulator which has told the user how to protect their radioactive sources, what happens if there's a need for enforcement? What happens if there's a lack of compliance to meet the measures prescribed by the regulatory body? I'm sure it'll depend on the legal system, but in my country, it's very difficult for the regulator to take enforcement action against a user if the user has simply done what the regulator has told them to do, even though it might turn out not to be enough. It does compromise the ability to successfully take enforcement action. And what I'm saying is that the regulatory body at a senior level needs to recognize that and needs to appreciate that their ability to behave in the way that they might outside of the arena of radioactive source security might be different. The other thing, clearly, is that the regulatory body must be expert in physical protection, in security. And if they're not, then they've got to get that expertise from somewhere else. Now, as I say, my experience is that there's a tendency for regulatory bodies to assume they're experts. I don't believe that's the case. I believe that the people who know best how to run their business are the people actually running that business. So there's a need for a change of mindset, a change of approach, a cultural shift by the regulatory body. They're going to have to accept that they need to get advice, either by training their own people, which means bringing in trainers of some kind, or by seeking expertise that can be trusted from elsewhere. And this was the dilemma that we faced in the UK. How to address this when, let's say, 18, 19 years ago, there was no expertise in radioactive source security within the regulatory body. What there was a very low level of what we called security, which bore no resemblance to the sort of measures that we put in place these days. So let's look specifically at how we do these things in the UK. We have what we call the environmental permitting regulations, which are about the keeping and using of radioactive sources. And they're just regulations. I'm not going to give you any details. They don't contain any details. The main regulatory instrument is the authorization, which we call a permit. And even that doesn't have a great deal of detail. What we do instead is that we point to another document. Now, this is unfortunately all I can show you in the picture on the right is the front cover of this document. It's a classified document that's owned by the police and the security service in the UK. But in there, I described all the measures that need to be put in place to protect radioactive sources. And I'll let you into a little secret. The first half of this document is almost exactly the IAEA documents, Nuclear Security Series 11 and 14. But we chose to take this approach. Sorry, that's a bit premature. Just bear with me one moment. So we chose to take this approach, and we established a working relationship with the police. Now, crime prevention is a role of the police in the UK, and simple crime prevention methods used to protect things like gold and jewellery and cash. The industrial practices are the sorts of practices that we use to protecting radioactive source security in this prescriptive approach. And we have formed a relationship with police officers around the country who have been trained in physical protection to take this approach. They're specialists in security. They don't just do radioactive substances, they do such things as security of public spaces and pathogens and toxins, facilities that work with these materials, as well as radioactive sources. So these specialist police officers have other things to do, but they are available to us as regulators to provide their expertise. And this arrangement has been in place for a number of years and still works well. Now, the details of regulation in the UK are very complex. I'm not going to go into them, but the organisations, the part of the regulatory body that does this, the environment agencies in the UK, and the specialist policemen, the experts in physical security, are called counter-terrorism security advisors, or CTSAs. And they give advice to the regulator on the selection and the adequacy of security measures. So the CTSA has the expert. The standards that they're referring to are provided by the document illustrated on the left. And they have been trained by their own security organisation to a high level of expertise. This so-called security requirements for radioactive sources document draws very, very much, as I said previously, on the IAEA approach, and it's almost identical to what you'll see in IAEA documents. And at the back, there's a list of the standards that are used. That's the reason that the document is classified, so the adversary is not aware of what the standards are that he's got to defeat. Part of the process is that regulator will, before someone applies for an authorization or a registration, a permit if you like, they will go along and give advice. They will make an inspection even before the site is on their books, so to speak. This enables them to be certain that the level of security that's required is there even before the radioactive sources arrive on the site. And compliance inspections are usually done jointly by the regulatory body and by one of these specialist policemen. So they assess compliance. And normally that would be annually. Either the regulatory body or the police can go to the premises at any time as they wish. But there will be a formal annual inspection. Now, the police have no powers of entry or inspection or enforcement under this legislation. So the regulation is very much done by the regulatory body, but the expertise is lodged firmly with the police, with the counter-terrorist security advisors. And this level of collaboration between the police and the regulatory body works very well for us and has done for something over 16 years now. And the good thing about it is it was quick to implement because the police already had this expertise, and it doesn't put high costs on the operators. Yes, they have to pay for security measures. They have to pay for fences for doors, for locks and so on. But in this country, they tend to be able to accept that. But what they would not accept is additional expenditure for the ongoing employment of an expert, either as a consultant or in-house. And consequently, I believe they have a reasonable level of respect for the regulatory body. We have a good relationship with most users most of the time. And the costs for the regulator are low because the number of hours that need to be spent in compliance assessment on each site are really very low. I don't like checklists very much, but it's good to say that, in this case, there's an element of checklist to assessing compliance. and from the efficiency point of view, that is quite good. So let's have another quick question. If you've got any physical protection expertise in your country, where does it lie, do you think? Is it with operators or users? Do people use external experts? Are the regulators expert? Or is there none yet in your country? Or you simply don't know? So let's have a couple of minutes while you think about that and respond, please.
Thanks, Chris. While people are just putting their answers in there, just want to draw your attention. We've got about it's been about 40 minutes, so if you were able just to skip ahead a little, or that'd be much appreciated. Thanks.
Okay. Right. Do we have a response? Right. That's interesting. A reasonable proportion of expertise in the operators and quite a lot of use of external experts and even the regulatory body. I have to say ours have learnt a lot, but I don't think our regulators would describe themselves as experts. It's very pleasing to see that the number of people saying there's none yet is very low. That's very good. Right, let's move on and speed up a little bit. So the security requirements are provided by the document that I've described to you. They're applied to high activity sealed sources and what we call similar sources with a similar level of potential hazard, which means things that might be of interest to the adversary. The inspections are done jointly, and there's a requirement for these security measures in the licenses, the permits as we call them. And one of the requirements is that the license holder must allow inspection of the site. So this is pretty standard stuff. And I would hope that most of you are very familiar with the IAEA's approach to source categorization, the 5 categories approach that they describe in RSG 1.9. It's basically what we do. And the use of the source activity in the D value for any particular radionuclide. You'll probably recognize this table where source categories are grouped into what we call security groups according to practice. So it's possible to determine the source category just by practice. That should be familiar to you. And you'll probably be familiar with the calculation where it's required of A over D values, the D values being provided by the IAEA documents. This should all be, I would hope, quite familiar stuff, and if it's not, then let us know and we can point you to the IAEA documents. The UK arrangements go on to show the implementation of these and the objectives that have to be met. So for the highest category sources, we're trying to prevent unauthorized removal. For lower category, minimize the likelihood of unauthorized removal, and so on. And there are some basic requirements underpin all of those, which are on the slide. This is the so-called graded approach. And this is standard IAEA stuff. Within the authorization, there is some detail. This is a legally enforceable document which enables the regulator to ensure that the security measures prescribed by the expert policeman are implemented properly. And the requirements are listed there for you to review. They should be very familiar to you. There are a couple of additional points I'd just like to make. One is that in Europe, there's a drive, there was when UK was part of the European Union, to minimize the inventory, to ensure that users only have sources for their actual needs. Information security is a very big issue in the UK. All information about sources is classified, as it's called. And it's another subject for another day, but we found that professional societies, particularly in radiation protection, have been very helpful in establishing the culture and the relationship between regulators and users. But the most important thing I want to say is about enforcement. Enforcement has to be written down. The policy, the approach to enforcement has to be written down in this country. And the penalties for non-compliance are also written into law. But the reality is in the UK, we've so far, and I checked this just this week, we've had no prosecutions for failures of facilities security. None at all. Now, I think that's a good thing. I think that shows that this high level of compliance is being achieved, which is the outcome that we want. An outcome-based approach, I think, is far superior to simply meeting performance targets. So I would argue that the regulatory culture has achieved a high level of compliance, which reflects the relationship with users and has established a strong security culture across the users of radioactive sources in the UK. Some people would see this as a failure of regulation, not to have had any prosecutions in 16 years. But it reflects the good relationship that the regulators have built up with users and that normal approach. It still means we take prosecutions when required, but none of them have been required at all for failures of compliance and security. Generally, at least with regard to security, users see inspections as helpful, as positive things, because they are as motivated to deal with protection of the sources as the regulator is. So we have achieved, I think, a strong security culture across source users in the UK. Now, as to how to achieve that, we haven't got time to go into it, but if you're not familiar already, Nuclear Security Series publication 7 from the IAEA will give you their take on how to establish that. And of course, King's College is particularly prominent in nuclear security issues. What I would say, and this goes back to George Foster's presentation, is that good leadership and management are absolutely essential for the vision and consistency and the recognition of the need to shift from target as a driver to security outcomes as the preferred approach. And part of this is the courage of the regulator to understand that the user needs to have some insight, not much perhaps, but some insight into the level of threat. Now, to finish off very quickly, I'll just tell you about a transport regulatory failure in the UK, where a source was stolen in my part of the world. I'm speaking from northwest England. It was in the back of a van that's being transported. It was stopped overnight, and it was reported missing and became a very high-profile incident because a minister became involved, and it took a month for it to be recovered. Now, this sort of thing happens very regularly. I'm sure it happens in your country too. But in terms of a failure, it was an example of where the public impression from this was probably disproportionate to the risk. There was no indication of terrorism being involved. There's a lot of precedent for this. It happens once or twice a year, every year in the UK. But there was a huge damage to the reputation of the regulatory body as a result of this. So we don't get it right all the time. Maybe the transport regulator for security for radioactive sources needs to look at the latest IAEA guidance. There's just been a new version published of Nuclear Security Series number 9, and I'd urge you to have a look at that and get up to date on these things. So to finish off, some people have said previously that the lack of enforcement action in the UK represents a soft approach to regulation. I don't believe for one moment that it is. I think it's a nuanced approach to regulation, and it's about recognizing and achieving a good influence of the regulatory culture on the national security culture. It seems to me to create a positive feedback loop. And from the point of view of security of radioactive sources, that's exactly what we want to achieve. So that's all I've got to say this morning. I hope it's been useful for you. I hope there's been something which you can take away and reflect on. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Chris. That was really interesting. Yeah, we've got some very good questions coming up. So just a reminder, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A function, not the chat box. But Chris, I think some of these reflect some of your earlier content. Would it be possible to say, if a regulator has a subordinate relationship with its users, which is something you alluded to earlier, how can it become more assertive? Does it need new powers or reorganizing, or can it change that relationship from within? If it can, what can it do?
That's a good question. Well, I did some, I can't think of the term, some advisory visits on behalf of the IAEA with international teams to a number of countries, one of which I remember particularly in South America. And in that particular country, the presence of a supportive visiting international team, where people from various parts of the world shared a vision of how regulation should work, was a useful sort of mentoring approach. And the IEA will, on request, provide that sort of support to any member state. In fact, I believe to any state, but certainly to any member state. So if you want that sort of support, go to the IEA. As far as the other things that would help, I think, I mean, I'd love to have another opportunity to talk about this, but I strongly believe that what in the UK we call professional societies. So for example, radiation protection and security, we have professional bodies, and they are very influential and increasingly of high status. And they have the ability to bring a lot of influence to bear, and also to provide a safe forum for regulators and operators to behave as equals. Now, this is a very difficult idea for me to convey to anyone, and over the internet, it feels even more difficult. But just having regulators and users sharing lunch in the middle of a technical meeting seems to me to be a good way of building a relationship. It's a very subtle thing, but if a state can establish professional societies, for example, radiation protection and security, as two separate bodies perhaps, getting practitioners and regulators together and just sharing space, sharing conversations, that would be very beneficial. It may start off very awkward, people will be very wary of each other. Certainly operators are always very wary of regulators, I find. But over a year or two, those relationships will break down and become more positive. But they do have to have an assertive relationship and not a subordinate one. I hope that's addressed those issues, Carl.
No, thank you. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to combine two questions now, just about the outcome and target-based approaches. But thank you, Chris, for explaining the benefits of the prescriptive regulation approach for users of radioactive materials. Do you think the RB should also communicate this approach via more training to the users? Security arrangements are still at odds with many users of radioactive sources.
Yes, I do. I mean, the trouble is that they're not necessarily funded to do that. The regulators, particularly working with in our context in the UK, working with the police advisors, we have been able to provide training. It's fairly brief training because all the expertise have to be with the policeman. But working through the professional society, sorry, this is one of my things, I really do think it's important. There is a training course available in the UK for UK practitioners where they will be given a day, just a day, of training by regulators and by the police. And that day, for us, is all we believe is necessary because they can always refer to the police. So however it has to be done, however it has to be configured, I think providing training is really important if the regulatory body can do it.
Sorry, Chris, we lost you just there. Your sound cut out. Could you say that again?
Yes. What I'm trying to say is that I think it's really important if the regulatory body can afford to do it, that they provide training for users in security. That may be done in one day. It may be it's a more extended course. But the regulators, perhaps supported by their technical advisors, in our case policemen, can and will do that if they're properly funded. And that's about influencing government to get that funding.
No, thank you, Chris. Okay. Again, I think professional bodies and influence come in there. Just a very quick one for Beth here. Just about the DBT. Could you just go through that again? Who should prepare it? The regulatory body, the operator, the government, and how should they interact with operators?
Okay, well, that's a very good question, and I didn't have time to explain it. Generally speaking, the design basis threat is a product of the state's security apparatus. So in our case, the security services working together will generate a design basis threat for the nuclear industry. So as far as I'm aware, everywhere around the world, it's the security services that do it, because they have access to the most sensitive information that the regulators and certainly the operators don't. So when I said that the DBT is shared with operators, the most sensitive intelligence will not be shared, but only the outcomes will be shared with the operator.
Okay. No, thank you, Chris. So the government, the intelligence services put together a list. Their sources and things are kept secret as per process, but actually the operator gets a small threat assessment. That
a summary, yes.
Yeah, summary. Excellent. And I know we're coming up to the top of the hour, so thank you for joining us. For participants, I think I'm going to ask the last two questions. Okay. One from Abdul Majid from Yemen. Great, thanks there. Based on our interaction with users in my country, categorization of RAS is only really known to the RB staff. Have you seen this problem in other countries? And how can you really get users to understand and categorize groups of radioactive sources?
Well, I have seen it in other countries, yes. Developing countries, there'll be relatively few people perhaps who had the benefit of training in this sort of thing, but some industries just have to continue, despite not perhaps having the level of training that might be seen in the same industry in other countries. So it's not uncommon. I think it's entirely feasible that the categorization is done only by the regulators. I don't see a problem with that. What to me matters more is that the users who don't understand the maths, don't understand the IAEA requirements, but they are motivated to ensure that the security measures that are put in place suitably to protect those categories of sources that they hold, sustain that. So the effort, I think, is best put into training the users a little bit about why it's important, but particularly how to ensure that they maintain the standards that they've been probably told to put in place. So I would say, don't worry about it too much, let the regulators do it, but focus on the users so that they can understand and be motivated to sustain security standards.
Okay, so again, that issue of communication, both with your peers, but also the people you're working with.
Exactly.
Thank you, Chris. And my last question here has come in just about the difference between the prescriptive approach or an outcome-based approach. I have a question really is, what is distinctly different that underpins the outcome-based approach? Is the unambiguous attribution of risk within legal frameworks? Actually, sorry, I'll just read this again, sorry. The participant isn't entirely convinced the difference between the so-called prescriptive approach and an outcome-based approach is so different, except in its application of design processes and resulting measures. So is there anything distinctly different underpinning the outcome-based approach? Would you want to comment on this?
Well, first of all, it's probably the way I structured it, but there's two ideas here, and I'd like to just separate them slightly. One is the difference between what I've called an outcome-based approach, which is whether or not you achieve successful protection of the sources at a suitable level for their level of potential harm, or whether you focus on the normal regulatory body concerns about performance indicators, how many inspections have been done, how many non-compliances, how many enforcement, how regulatory bodies often work. So that's one idea. The other idea is the difference between a performance-based approach, which is used in the nuclear industry very often, which is very labor intensive, and the prescriptive approach, which I'm saying I think is better for radioactive sources. There are developed countries and developing countries that use the performance-based approach for protecting radioactive sources. But my perception is many of them are actually drifting back to the more straightforward prescriptive approach. In terms of the outcome of those two, if suitable security is achieved and sustained, well, that outcome can be provided by either route. But my experience is, in order to work successfully with operators, it's good for the regulatory body to be sensitive to their particularly commercial pressures of costs, additional costs. And I believe those costs can be kept to a minimum by using a prescriptive approach. That's not shared by any means by, for example, I don't know, North American regulators who still prefer the performance-based approach. So the outcome is acceptable security. How you achieve it is your local decision. I'm saying prescriptive is best.
Okay, no, thank you, Chris. I think, yes, tailored solutions for the particular circumstances.
Exactly, yes.
Excellent, that's great. Well, Chris, I think that's great for the questions. So thank you very much for joining us, everyone. We're going to have a very quick survey at the end of this. So please do take the time to fill it in so we can improve the sessions. We're looking forward to seeing you next time. So Chris, if you have that slide, that would be great. But we're looking forward to seeing you next time. The next webinar is on the 22nd of October, where we'll be joined by Noel Camp, who will be taking us through insider threats. So look out for that email, look out for a survey, and thank you for joining us. See you next time. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.